I started jogging at night about a year ago. I switched to nighttime jogs because there's less car and bike traffic to deal with. Plus, it's usually cooler at night since I'm not a fan of running in the heat of the day. Usually, I stick to the well-lit streets around my neighborhood. But one night, I decided to explore a new route through a less familiar part of town. It was a beautiful night out, and I just finished my regular 5 miles, and I felt good, so I kept going. I headed into an area with fewer streetlights, and these streets were deserted. Only the occasional car passed by, and the sound of my shoes hitting the pavement was really the only noise. I rounded a corner onto a street that I had never been down before. The houses were older, and the yards were not as well maintained. I figured I'd just make a loop through the neighborhood and then head back home. A few blocks in, I noticed a man walking ahead of me on the other side of the street. A short time later, it took me a while to realize it, but I saw that the man had now crossed over to my side of the street and was jogging behind me. I thought this was odd because he had been walking before, and now he was running the same route that I was going, seemingly following me. He was moving steadily, like he was matching my speed, and every time I picked up the pace, he did too. It was subtle, but it made me uncomfortable. Wanting to see what would happen, I slowed down my pace, and when I did, he did as well. I then quickened my steps, and again he matched me. He was far enough behind me that whenever I would glance back, I couldn't see his face clearly. But he was wearing dark clothes, and his movements were steady and deliberate. I tried to think rationally that maybe it was a coincidence, but I still felt uneasy. I approached a street where the lighting was better, hoping to feel a little bit safer. I glanced back and saw that the man had turned onto the street behind me. He was still following, at a distance, but unmistakably following me now. I didn't want to confront him or make it obvious that I was scared, but I wanted to lose him before going back home. I decided to head towards a more populated area, hoping to lose him in the crowd. I took a few more turns, running faster than usual. Each time I looked back, the man was still there, moving through the shadows. It was like he was determined to stay out of the streetlights, making it harder for me to get a good look at him. Finally, I saw a group of people gathered outside of a bar. They were chatting and laughing, and I went towards them. As I approached, I took one last look behind me. The man had stopped at the edge of the lighted area, just standing there, watching. I sprinted the rest of the way to the bar and stopped, trying to catch my breath. Looking back, I saw the man turn and walk away, disappearing into the darkness. I stayed at the bar for a while, and even went to get some water to pass the time just in case. When I finally felt like enough time had passed, I jogged back home, sticking to well-lit streets and staying close to houses. I didn't see the man for the rest of my jog, and after that night, I stuck to areas that I knew well and where I usually jogged. I've been jogging through my neighborhood for years, sticking mostly to familiar routes. One time, it was a quiet evening, just cool enough to make running pleasant. I ended up taking a route that I ran quite often on a street where the houses are old and the streetlights are spaced really far apart. On this route, there was this one house which had been abandoned for as long as I could remember. The yard was overgrown, the paint on the house was peeling, and the windows were boarded up. I asked my parents once why it had been abandoned for so long, and they told me that somebody had died tragically inside and nobody wanted to buy it, so it just sat there rotting. That night, as I ran past the abandoned house, I noticed something strange. The house's front door, which had always been securely boarded up, was slightly open. The boards were still there, but they looked loose, like somebody had forced their way in. I slowed down, trying to see if anything else was out of place. I noticed a faint light flickering inside. I thought that it might be a trick of the streetlights or maybe a reflection, but the light was too consistent. It looked like a candle or a small lamp, and it was moving, bouncing up and down as if somebody was walking with it. I stopped running and I approached the house cautiously. Peering through the gap in the door, I noticed shadows moving around inside. It was difficult to make out any details, but the movement was unmistakable. There were at least 2 figures moving inside. It could easily have been a group of kids who felt brave and wanted to explore in an abandoned building. I was about to continue my run, but something was drawing me in, and I decided to stay. At first, I had a thought that maybe it was just some kids inside, but I doubted myself as I smelled heavy cigar smoke, and I questioned why someone exploring wouldn't just use a flashlight instead of candles. The shadows were more distant now, as more candles had been lit and I could see better inside. There were plenty of shadows revealing that it was a group of people inside, but all I could make out was the figure of a person sitting in a chair. The figure was making a lot of hand gestures and seemed to be talking about something passionately. I could hear muffled voices, but they were too quiet to understand. Just then, one of the boards from the front door that I had been leaning on snapped a little, making a sharp popping noise. The figure that was sitting in the chair was quiet and shifted their body towards the front door before quickly moving and blowing out the candles. I had revealed that I was there with the snapping of the wood, and I wasn't going to wait around to see what happened next. I felt a rush of fear, and I took off running. I didn't stop until I reached the street that my house was on. When I got home, I thought about calling the police, but I wasn't even sure what I would tell them that I had seen. I really didn't know. The next day on my way to work, I drove past the abandoned house again. The front door was closed, and the boards were patched across it again, with no sign of activity inside. Now, on every jog I go down the street with the abandoned house, I'm curious to see if there's any activity inside, but I haven't seen anything else since that night. I like going on jogs to stay in shape, and even when I'm on vacation, I usually find a way to get a run in. I stayed at my cabin for a few days on a weekend in September. The cabin was situated on a dirt road that wound through a dense forest. It's peaceful there, which is exactly what I was looking for. The sun was setting as I set out for my jog, and the light was starting to fade. I was used to running on these roads, so the diminishing light didn't bother me. As I ran, the road became darker, and the trees seemed to close in around me. I kept my pace steady, trying to clear my mind. There's something about running alone in the woods that makes you acutely aware of your surroundings. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig makes you wonder if an animal is out there. Halfway through my run, an old pickup truck passed me by going the other way. Normally, I didn't see any cars out there, but there were other cabins nearby. I never really tried to stop by or get to know any of the other owners of the cabins on the road, but I figured that they were pretty normal people. I finished the loop I was jogging, and as I arrived, I turned up the driveway towards my cabin. The old pickup truck drove past me again, and the man inside gave me a friendly wave. I didn't think much of it at the time, as I didn't know anybody who lived in the neighboring cabins. By the time I got back to the cabin, it was dark. I let myself in, went through my usual routine of showering and preparing dinner, and then I settled down on the couch with a book. Later that night, close to 10 p.m., once it had gotten fully dark, I heard the sound of a car engine far away, but it sounded closer to my cabin than it should have, like they had gone up the driveway a little bit. I then heard heavy footsteps on the porch and the unmistakable sound of somebody trying to turn the doorknob. My heart started pounding in my chest. I called the police, but my cabin was in the middle of nowhere, so I was told it would be a little while before they arrived. I knew I had to protect myself if it came to that, so I grabbed a heavy flashlight and a broom. Not exactly ideal weapons, but it was all that I had. Whoever was outside began pounding on the door. It sounded like they were really trying to force their way in. After a while, the banging stopped, and I could hear the intruder's footsteps moving quickly, circling the cabin, looking for another entrance, I presume. Thankfully, all the windows were on the second level and out of reach of the intruder, unless they had a ladder. Eventually, I heard a car engine start and the intruder drive away. When the police arrived, I didn't have much to tell them, besides earlier when I was on my jog, the man in the old pickup truck had driven by me twice. The officer notified me that he had actually driven by the truck on the way to the cabin, and he might have his license plate on camera. Nothing eventful happened the rest of the nights that I was staying in the cabin, and I never heard back from the police department either. I guess they didn't catch a license plate, or it wasn't worth investigating, since it was just a hunch based on a truck that I had seen earlier that night while jogging. When I decided to take a weekend vacation at a rural Airbnb, I I was hoping for some peace and quiet. The listing had promised beautiful scenery and a cozy place to stay on a working farm. I'm not one for the farm life, but the idea of waking up to the sound of birds and getting some fresh air sounded perfect. On the second morning of my stay, I woke up early. I've been trying to get back into a jogging routine, so I thought this would be the perfect place to do it. I got dressed, laced up my sneakers, and headed out the front door. The farmhouse was surrounded by a large open field with a few scattered barns. I started jogging along a dirt path that seemed to wind around the edge of the property. It was peaceful, and I found myself settling into a comfortable rhythm. After about a mile, I noticed a small, overgrown path leading off into the woods. I wasn't planning to go that way, but something about it piqued my curiosity. I decided to see where it went, and I turned off the main path to follow the narrower trail. It was less maintained, with branches reaching out and the ground uneven beneath my feet. This path led me deeper into the woods, and soon I could no longer see the farmhouse or the fields. I was still enjoying the jog until I came upon a clearing. At first, it looked like just another open space in the woods, but then I saw something odd. In the middle of the clearing was an old, broken-down structure. It looked like a shed or a small cabin, but it was partially collapsed and covered in thick vines. The door hung loosely on its hinges, and the windows were either boarded up or shattered. I slowed to a walk and approached the building. Peering through one of the broken windows, I could see a dusty interior with old furniture covered in cobwebs. There was a rusted metal shelf with what looked like old jars and cans, but nothing that really caught my eye. I decided to take a few pictures with my phone. I wanted to show them to the Airbnb host later and ask about the building, just out of curiosity. Later that day, I mentioned the weird structure to the host when I saw them in the kitchen. Their reaction was immediate and unsettling. They went pale and said, "Oh, you found that place? You shouldn't go near it." When I asked why, they avoided eye contact and said that it wasn't safe and had been abandoned for years. Later that evening, as I reviewed the photos on my phone, I noticed something disturbing. In one of the pictures of the inside of the building, there was a figure, just a shadowy outline, standing in the corner of the room. I stared at it, trying to convince myself it was a trick of the light or a result of the poor photo quality, but the figure looked too defined to be a mere glitch. The next Monday, after returning from my weekend trip, I couldn't stop thinking about the building and my photos of the place. When I got home from work, I did a quick search online to see if I could come by any information on the property. To my surprise, I found an old news article from decades ago. It was about a family that lived on the farm, but they had mysteriously disappeared. There were no leads or explanations, just an empty farmhouse and an investigation that had gone cold. I got chills just sitting in my house as I read the article about what I had stumbled across on my jog unknowingly. It was a cool fall morning when I decided to go for a jog. I had just moved to a new city and was trying to get into a routine. The neighborhood I was in seemed nice enough, and the streets were quiet in the early morning. I set out at around 6 a.m., thinking it would be a peaceful start to the day. The route that I chose was a loop through a park and some quiet streets nearby. The park was a bit secluded, with only a few early risers walking their dogs. I jogged along the path, enjoying the crisp air and the sound of leaves crunching under my feet. Everything felt normal until I made my way to the street section of my route. As I turned onto a side street, I noticed a man walking towards me. He looked disheveled, but I didn't think much of it. I gave him a polite nod and continued jogging. That's when I heard footsteps behind me. I glanced back and saw the same man had turned around and was walking quickly in my direction. Before I could react, he was right beside me. I slowed down, feeling uneasy. He said hello, his voice gravelly. I was about to say something when he suddenly grabbed my arm. His grip was firm, and I felt a rush of panic. "Give me your stuff," he demanded. I tried to pull away, but he was stronger than I expected. I saw a small knife in his hand, barely visible, but enough to make me realize that he wasn't playing around. I was on a jog, so the only thing of importance that I had was my fitness watch, which I handed to him. He backed away slowly, still watching me closely. "Just stay there," he said, before turning and running off down the street. I stood frozen for a moment, trying to catch my breath and make sense of what had just happened. I couldn't call the police until I jogged back home, and I gave them a description over the phone of the guy and where it all happened. I couldn't help but think about how close I had come to something much worse. The knife had been so close, and I wondered what might have happened if I had resisted. I lost my watch, which sucked, but I was thankful that I hadn't been hurt. What didn't make much sense to me was that the guy tried to rob me while I was on a run. He couldn't have thought that he was getting much stuff from the robbery. In the end, I never found out what happened to the man or if he was caught. It was scary how it happened so quickly and escalated to a dangerous level over a watch at 6 a.m. in the morning.